Okay guys, so today we have 4.3, which is another method of factoring called factoring trinomials. Now remember, the word trinomial means that there are three terms. So inside a trinomial is something with 1, 2, 3 terms. So how do we factor a trinomial? Well, before we were given a problem that looked like this, and then we use either FOIL or box method to multiply it out. X times x gives me x squared. X times negative 3 gives me minus 3x. 2 times x gives me plus 2x. And then 2 times negative 3 gives me negative 6. After I combine like terms, I get x squared minus x minus 6. And that used to be our answer. Today, I'm going to give you something that looks like this, so a trinomial, and I'm going to want you to break it up into this. So the question is, how do I know that the numbers here are supposed to be 2 and negative 3? That's really what we want to know here. And what we're going to be doing is using these terms, which are known as b and c. B is the number that's in front of x. So in this example that we just did, b is actually going to be negative 1, and c is the constant, which in this case is negative 6. So we're going to be using those two numbers, the very last number and the number attached to x, in order to determine what numbers go inside the parentheses. So we have a method called the diamond method. In the diamond method, there are 3 steps. So step 1 is we're going to set up the diamond. And the diamond looks like this. It's actually an X, but we call it a diamond. So you're going to set up your diamond. And the C, or that last number, in this case negative 6, goes at the top. And B, the number in front of x squared, or the number in front of x, goes at the bottom. So C goes at the top, B goes at the bottom. Step 2, we want to figure out which factors add up to C and which factors of C add up to B, and put each of those in the sides. So we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to C and add up to B. So we want to multiply to the top and add to the bottom. So there's going to be 2 numbers that we put on the sides. And then we'll be able to rewrite the trinomial as the product of 2 binomials. So we'll have 2 binomials here. Let's actually do an example of this. So example 1, and I'm going to leave the steps up. Example 1, I have x squared plus 7x plus 10, and I want to factor this. So I'm going to use the diamond method. So first thing is I want to set up my diamond. And C goes at the top of the diamond. So positive 10 is going to go up at the top. And positive 7 is going to go at the bottom. So now we want to figure out what numbers multiply to 10 and also add up to 7. So the numbers that multiply to 10, we have 1 times 10 and 2 times 5. And those are the only 2 things that multiply up to 10. So which of these 2 choices also add up to 7? 2 and 5. 2 times 5 gives me 10, and 2 plus 5 gives me 7. So my two factors are 2 and 5. So then step 3 says we want to write these as a product of two binomials. So I'm going to set up my binomials. My variable is x squared, so I'm going to write x and x in each of the front. And then plus 2 goes in one, and plus 5 goes in the other. And that would be my answer. Now to check this, we can just multiply this out using FOIL or the box. So x plus 2 times x plus 5. Let's FOIL that out. X times x gives me x squared. X times 5 gives me plus 5x. 2 times x gives me plus 2x. And 2 times 5 gives me plus 10. When I combine like terms, that gives me x squared plus 7x plus 10, which is what I started with, so we factored correctly. Let's look at another example, because I don't expect you guys to get this after only doing it once. So we have a trinomial here, r squared plus 4r plus 3. So I'm going to set up my diamond. The last number, positive 3, goes at the top. Positive 4 goes at the bottom. And I'm looking for the two numbers that multiply to 3 and add up to 4. Now there's only two things that multiply to 3, and that's 3 and 1. But let's do a quick test. 3 times 1 gives me 3, and 3 plus 1 gives me 4. So it looks like we got the right numbers. So let's set up our binomials. My variable this time is r, so I'm going to put r at the front of each one. And then the order does not matter if I put plus 1 or plus 3 first. So it doesn't matter which order you put the two binomials in, plus 1 first or plus 3 first, they're all going to multiply out to the same. And that's your answer. Let's do a check. So I want to multiply r plus 1 times r plus 3. R times r gives me r squared. R times 3 is plus 3r. 1 times r is plus 1r. And 1 times 3 is plus 3. Combine like terms. So I get r squared plus 4r plus 3, which is what we started with, so we factored correctly. Example 3. This time we have a negative involved. We have x squared minus 2x plus 1. So I'm going to set up my diamond. Plus 1 goes in the top, and negative 2 goes in the bottom. Now I'm trying to find two numbers that multiply to positive 1 but add up to negative 2. Now there's only two numbers that multiply to 1 at all, and that's 1 and 1. 1 times 1 gives me positive 1. But 1 plus 1 gives me positive 2, not negative 2. But if I make both of these a negative, negative 1 times negative 1 gives me positive 1. And negative 1 plus negative 1 gives me negative 2. So I think my factoring is going to be x minus 1 times x minus 1. Let's do a quick check of that. So x minus 1 times x minus 1. X times x gives me x squared. X times negative 1 is negative 1x. Negative 1 times x is negative 1x. And negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. When I combine like terms, I get x squared minus 2x plus 1, which is what I started with. Example 4. So there's another negative in here. Now, when we're dealing with negatives, we always have to be careful. So first thing we do is set up our diamond and fill it in. So I have positive 28 goes at the top, and negative 16 goes at the bottom. So now I'm looking for the numbers that multiply to positive 28. I know that 1 times 28 gives me 28, but 1 times 28, or 1 plus 28, definitely doesn't give me negative 16. I also know that 2 times 14 gives me positive 28. And 2 plus 14 gives me positive 16. So if I change both of those to negative, negative 2 times negative 14 gives me positive 28, and negative 2 minus 14 gives me negative 16. So it looks like those are my two numbers. So we have k minus 2 times k minus 14. We always want to check. So let's just double check. K minus 2 times k minus 14. K times k gives me k squared. K times negative 14 gives me negative 14k. Negative 2 times k is negative 2k. And negative 2 times negative 14 is positive 28. If I combine like terms, that gives me k squared minus 16k plus 28, which is what I started with. So it seems to me like if everything is positive, both of my integers are going to be positive, both of these numbers. But if my multiplication is positive and my addition is negative, both of them have to be negative. So what happens then when I have multiplied to a negative? So example 5, I have m squared plus 3m minus 10. So let's set up our diamond. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add up to positive 3. Well, I know that 1 times 10 gives me 10, but it adds up to 11. And then the only other factor is 2 times 5. Well, 2 times 5 definitely gives me 10, but 2 plus 5 gives me 7. But 2 minus 5 will give me negative, or 5 minus 2 will give me 3. So I'm thinking that it has to do something with 2 and 5. But both of these are supposed to multiply to a negative. So I need one to be negative and one to be positive. If I need one of my numbers to be negative and one to be positive, but add up to a positive, the bigger one has to be positive, which means 2 has to be negative. Let's test it. Negative 2 times positive 5 gives me negative 10. Negative 2 plus 5, or 5 minus 2, gives me positive 3. So let's say, for right now, we have x minus 2 times x plus 5. But let's definitely check it. X minus 2 times x plus 5. That's going to give me x squared plus 5x minus 2x minus 10. 5x minus 2x gives me positive 3x minus 10, which is what we started with, so we are done. Except all the x's should be m's. So our answer should actually be m's, not x's. Okay. Let's try another one like that. So example 6. X squared plus 3x minus 4. First thing is let's set up our diamond. Negative 4 on top, positive 3 on bottom. And I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 4 and add up to positive 3. So if I'm trying to multiply to negative 4, one of my numbers has to be positive and one has to be negative, because a positive times a negative is how I get a negative. So the factors of 4 are 4 times 1 and 2 times 2. Now 2 times 2 multiply to 4, but they also add up to 4. If I subtract them, I get 0. So I don't think it's going to be 2 and 2. But 4 times 1 gives me 4, and 4 minus 1 gives me positive 3. So my 1 has to be negative, and my 4 has to be positive. So this is going to be x minus 1 times x plus 4. Let's check. X times x gives me x squared plus 4x minus 1x minus 4. 4x minus 1x gives me positive 3x minus 4, which is what I started with. So we factored correctly. So something similar, but the middle is negative this time as well. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 8 and add up to negative 2. So I need to list the factors of 8. 1 times 8 gives me 8, but added or subtracted I don't get 2. And then I have 2 times 4. 2 times 4 gives me 8. And added gives me 6, but if I subtract them, I get 2. So one of them has to be negative. Now let's think about it. 4 minus 2 gives me positive 2. But 2 minus 4 gives me negative 2. So I think my 4 has to be negative, and my 2 has to be positive. So that would mean q minus 4 times q plus 2. Let's check. Q minus 4 times q plus 2. Q times q gives me q squared plus 2q minus 4q minus 8. So that gives me q squared. 2q minus 4q gives me negative 2q minus 8. So we factored correctly. So if looking at example 6 and 7, if my last number is negative, I'm always going to have one positive and one negative, because a negative times a positive is how I get a negative. If my middle term is positive, the smaller number has to be negative. If my middle term is negative, the bigger one has to be negative. So let's see if that's true in our last example, example 8. We have x squared minus 14x minus 32. So if I set up my diamond, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 32 and add up to negative 14. Now, if what we figured out from the last example is true, my bigger number should be the negative one. So let's list the factors of 32. That's 1 times 32. That won't never give me 14. We also have 2 times 16. And 16 minus 2 gives me 14, so I think that that might work. So we have 2 and 16, but my answer should add up to a negative 14. So I think the 16 has to be negative, the bigger one. So we would have x plus 2 times x minus 16. So let's check it. X plus 2 times x minus 16. X times x gives me x squared. X times negative 16 is negative 16x. 2 times x is plus 2x. And 2 times negative 16 is negative 32. So that gives me x squared. Negative 16 plus 2 gives me minus 14x minus 32. So we factored correctly. I want you to make sure that in these problems you are always factoring. You are always checking after you're done factoring. So FOIL or box to check your answers, because I have seen so many times students getting the numbers wrong and it takes 30 seconds to check it. So if you spend 30 seconds checking each problem, you will ensure that you always get the right factorization.